Hi, I'm Clinton Bush, a professor at Albany Technical College, and I teach the Comp 1000 Introduction to Computer Literacy course. I'd like to welcome you to Week 2, covering Internet research. In this video, I'm going to talk about media bias. There are a couple of big issues with information you find online today. They are the most prevalent issues, and they are fake news and media bias. So let's talk about media bias. What is media bias? To define that, we need to understand what bias is. And bias is a tendency or opinion that you hold, usually one that is preconceived and unreasoned, meaning that it's not backed by any logical proof or any good particular reason that you hold that opinion. It's just one you formed over time, and it normally impacts the way you communicate to other people. Now, a good example of bias might be prejudice. So prejudice means you've already judged someone or something, like an idea or a person, based on things that don't even impact the particular trait you are judging about that person. The most well-known would be like racial prejudice. So you're judging someone's worth or validity or ability based on their race, and that makes absolutely no sense. And that speaks to the unreasoned part of bias. So media bias in particular refers to information presented through that lens of bias. And normally we mean that in a political sense. In other words, the piece of information being discussed is either conservatively biased or right-leaning, or liberally biased or left-leaning. And there are many ways that a person or media information can be biased. No one is immune from it. It's just a quality that it comes along with being human. It's part of our personality. As it develops over time, our experiences impact and influence those biases. So the key to that is being able to identify bias and correct it. So one thing to note is biased sources are not necessarily lying to you. In fact, the good ones don't lie. They just present information in a way that favors their opinion, and maybe they lie by omission. They only give you part of the picture. Ultimately, a biased information leads to an incomplete or inaccurate picture because you're getting someone's opinion, not objective facts. So let me give you a little history on bias. In the 1800s, most newspapers were clearly, overtly biased. In fact, they told you so in their names. They were linked to a political party. And if you do a little research, many papers today still bear names that reflect this. For example, the Arkansas Democrat Gazette or the Lincoln Sentinel Republican. And these are newspapers that are still in print today. And the notion of a completely objective source of information in the media developed more recently, the late 1800s, early 1900s, particularly with the advent of what was called the penny press, or papers that were cheaper and a little smaller, that were priced so that the working class could afford them. And when the papers started printing these, they realized that if they broadened their reader base by not limiting themselves to a single political party, they could get more readership and grow their audience, thereby growing their profits. And that is where we got the idea of an objective press. Now, back when papers were overtly political and overtly biased and told you as much, that was okay because you knew what you were buying. There was no subterfuge or hidden meanings to their words. They didn't try to hide the fact that they were biased. The problem today is that news sources are biased, but they claim to be objective and unbiased. And so then the onus is on you, the reader, to determine where the truth actually lies. So what is the problem with media bias? Well, the bottom line is that if you get your information from biased sources, you neither learn nor solve any of the real problems today, because you're only getting one side of the picture. So that is my opinion. That is my assessment of the situation. But to give you a little more objective sense of what the problems really are, media bias deprives you, the readers, of the entire picture. I've been saying that over and over. And in today's climate, it fans the flames of emotions in most cases. Because emotional and sensational articles and stories drive readership. They drive clicks on the internet. They drive viewership on cable news. And these emotions cloud your judgment. Another issue is that people who stick with biased sources of media remain uninformed or underinformed when it comes time to make decisions. And bias magnifies prejudices and personal biases. So not only are you getting your knowledge from a biased source, you're reinforcing your personal, already held biases. And it discourages dialogue and problem solving, because rather than using what is known as principled negotiation, where people make decisions based on the merits of the solutions that are available, they resort to what is known as positional negotiation, which means they pick a side and they double down on it regardless of the merits of the possible solutions on the table. So those are the issues with media bias. And now let's look at some types of media bias, and I'm going to cover just a few of these relatively quickly. I will provide a PDF of this presentation along with the video, so you can go through the others on your own if you'd like. I'm going to go through the first one, which is spin, a vague, dramatic, or sensational language. In this particular case, an author for the Business Insider writes that President Donald Trump gloated over mass layoffs at multiple news outlets on Saturday. The problem with this article is that they are using the word gloat, which means to smugly say something, and they are stating that the president takes pleasure in these layoffs. So, first of all, gloat has a negative connotation. That means the author is already casting this particular event in a negative light for the audience, which would be his opinion, not simply the facts, which is what he should have presented. And he is implying that President is being smug and taking pleasure in the fact that these layoffs happened, which he has no evidence to prove. The next one I'm going to go over is opinions presented as facts. So that is when you use subjective language or statements under the guise of objective facts. In this case, an author at Vox writes the EPA is lifting greenhouse gas limits on coal power plants, and the author asserts that the latest proposal won't stop the steady decline of the coal industry. The problem is the author provides no facts or scientific evidence or statistics or anything other than his assertion that the latest proposal will fail to help the coal industry. One of the biggest issues you're going to find is sensationalism, because that drives people's money. That builds viewership, readership, clicks, and it drives up money. So sensationalism or emotionalism is information presented in a way that gives shock or makes deep impression, or as I continue to say, fans the flames of emotion. In this case, the author writes, there will be plenty to gawk at Friday when North Korean leader Kim Jong-un walks across the world's most heavily armed border and stands face to face with South Korean President Moon Jae-in. So the term gawk means to stare stupidly. So the author is already casting these facts, this event, in a negative light. It seems that he is minimalizing it or making light of it, and using a provocative word, gawk. So he is sensationalizing it. He's making it appear as if this event, this meeting, will be almost worthless. or stupid or ineffective. But these are his opinions. These are not the facts. The author should have chosen better words that did not imply an understanding of this, and instead just presented the facts that there will be a meeting. Let's look at mind reading. This occurs in journalism when a writer assumes they know what another person thinks. In this article, CNN writer writes that Donald Trump's hatred of looking foolish and the Democrats' conviction that they have a winning hand is leaving the president with no way out of a stalemate over his border wall. The problem with this article is that the author assumes Donald Trump hates looking foolish, that Donald Trump is looking foolish, and that the Democrats are convinced they have a winning hand. These are three assumptions the author is making in the first sentence of the article. There's no way to measure objectively if the president thinks he looks foolish, or how much he looks foolish, or if he actually looks foolish, and there's no evidence that the Democrats believe they have a winning hand. Slant is when journalists tell only part of the story. This happens a lot today. In this particular article, the writer at Fox News writes, Ocasio-Cortez, she, along with Sanders, has received intense criticism for policy proposals like the Green New Deal. So, first of all, maybe she has received intense criticism, but the author failed to mention that she's also received quite a bit of praise for her proposal. Additionally, so has Sanders, Bernie Sanders. Yes, he has received criticism, in most part from the right, and he has received praise, mostly from the left. In this case, the author, from a news channel that is known to be biased to the right for the Republican Party conservative viewership, is only giving you the Republican Party or conservative side of the picture. So, again, this is called slant. And finally, I'm going to mention omission of source attribution. This occurs when the author fails to tell you who their sources of information are. In this particular article, they do this by using a pseudonym or pronoun for their source, but never actually saying who it is. They write, critics say, the Montgomery, Alabama-based SPLC. And then down here again, they say, critics say. But the problem is the author never tells you who the critics are. So maybe there are actually critics. We don't know what their credentials are, or if they have any position to be casting thoughts on this particular topic. Or even worse, and what I assume is probably the case, the critics are the author himself trying to pass off his opinions as being supported by facts, by experts that he fails to ever name. If you go on down, you've got bias by omission, which is where they just ignore complete and entire stories that support competing viewpoints, and bias by placement, which is where they hide stories or information that are contrary to their opinions by burying them in your search results or putting them on the last page of the magazine or other nefarious tactics of that nature. So let's talk about how do you spot media bias. Ask yourself these questions. What kind of information is it? Is it news, opinions, advertisements? So if it's opinions and it's labeled as such, that's great. You know it's going to be biased. It's an opinion after all. But if it's news, then you need to start being a little more wary and using these tools to decide whether you're getting the whole story. Does the information appeal to emotions, or does it cause you to think? In other words, are they trying to fan your emotions and get you worked up? Or are they simply giving you the facts and letting you decide for yourself? Are trustworthy sources cited? So this is a big one. If someone writes a story or an article and they use evidence that they get from people who are trusted and cited frequently and who you trust, then it's very likely the information you're using is going to be trustworthy. What is the main idea or point of the piece? And this may be hard to figure out, and that's where your critical thinking skills have to come into play. Figuring out what it is the author's really trying to tell you. often this doesn't match up with the title of the story, so that's why you really have to think about what you're reading. Did the author draw a conclusion for you, or did they present the facts and let you decide? So this goes back to the emotional thing that I mentioned, the second bullet point. Except in this case, the author may overtly tell you the conclusion you're supposed to get from the facts. And if they do, then you need to ask yourself, is this biased? And, in most cases, rather than taking their word for it, you should read through the facts and you decide what the bottom line is. Finally, ask yourself, what is missing? So did you miss a whole side of the story? They only give you a part of it, the part that supports their opinions. And let's talk about where you get your news. So there are a lot of news sources out there, and today they are becoming increasingly biased because they're pandering to their viewership. News sources have found that by targeting specific interest groups and sects of society, they can drive their readership more effectively and, of course, drive their profits. So instead of using these news sources, I encourage you to find those that are neutral. Or if you do choose to use a biased source, also use one that supports the other side of the story. Personally, and that's why I put this next line in italics, I enjoy listening and reading to viewpoints that challenge my own viewpoints and trying to find ways to disprove them. Alright, find ways to disprove them. If I can't disprove my viewpoints, then I accept that my viewpoints are correct. But if I can find ways to disprove them, then I adjust my opinions and adjust my biases. I accept the fact that I was wrong. And this is actually a pretty fun thing to do because it's interesting to find how much we have taken for granted over time based on our upbringing and maybe the viewpoints our parents instilled in us. And those that we just acquired from the people that we hang around or the information we've been taught in school. So let's look at this chart I've put on the screen. You can actually find this chart yourself. Just Google this website, Ad Fontes Media. And this company, this organization, tracks the bias of major news outlets throughout the year. And it's very interesting to find where our news sources fall. So I'm going to point out some of the big ones to you. Let me explain the chart first. So the horizontal axis, that's the bottom here, from left to right, measures political bias, and left is going to be liberal, or in most cases a Democratic Party supporting news organization, and right's going to be conservative, or news organizations that tend to support the Republican Party in America. And then the vertical axis, that is where the the news outlet falls from top to bottom, is going to measure how reliable the information is. So the closer the news organization is to the top, the more reliable. The closer they are to the bottom, the less reliable. So let's look at some major ones that you probably are familiar with. MSNBC, for example, measures in the hyper-partisan left. That means they are extremely biased, and they are extremely biased to the left, meaning they support the Democratic Party or liberal ideology. CNN is slightly less so, but they do skew left. And as you can see, MSNBC is neither very reliable nor very unreliable. CNN falls about here, so they are slightly more reliable than MSNBC, but not extremely reliable for their coverage and facts either. Another one you may be familiar with is Huffington Post. They're rather small here. Again, they skew left and are a little more reliable than CNN. Up here, you've got the New York Times. They tend to fall into the neutral or balanced, kind of on the left side of that. They are more reliable than these cable news outlets and the Huffington Post. And one of my favorites is NPR. This is one I listen to regularly on the radio. And the Associated Press, that is a website I tend to read pretty regularly. And they are fairly neutral and balanced and about as reliable as is offered on this chart. Another organization I like to use is Reason.com. So they are fairly neutral and reliable to some extent. They are definitely in the upper portions of that, on par with Huffington Post and CNN. And then you've got, you can't see it, but the New York Post is underneath there. You've got the Washington Times, who are pretty far to the right. Fox News Broadcast definitely skews to the right, and they are a little below mid-level on reliability. They're about equal with MSNBC on their partisanship and reliability. And then you've got Fox News Channel Online and the Federalist, and they are extremely partisan to the right and not quite so reliable. So I encourage you to look through this chart, find the news source you like to use, and ask yourself, where do they fall in reliability and partisanship? Should I maybe consider someone in this group up here? Or if you're like many of our parents and they've been watching MSNBC or Fox News religiously for many years, and you too like to watch those channels, that's fine. But I encourage you to pick someone else and read through their information. So, for example, my father watches Fox News, and I encourage him regularly to, hey, go listen to NPR. Okay? It's not going to hurt you. It might challenge some of your views, which could be a little uncomfortable, but you'll walk away with a little bit broader mindset, better view of the overall picture out there. Why? Because they're biased. They give you their side of the story. Okay? So the takeaway on this is you can use bias articles for research, but you need to try to limit their use to argumentative papers. In other words, if you're writing a paper to persuade somebody, that might be the place to use it. You should always try to balance the information with opposing views so you get the other side of the story. You need to avoid unintentionally biasing your work if you're citing biased sources. And finally, if you used biased sources, you need to ensure that their information cites good sources. In other words, if it's biased and they're giving you one side of the story, at least make sure that the side they're giving you is truthful, even though it may not be complete. Alright, that being said, I hope you learned a little something from this. I hope you walk away with a better understanding of what we as the people are being fed through the media outlets. I hope that maybe you can challenge your views a little bit, broaden your mind, and ultimately I hope that as you do internet research going forward in your educational career, you have some better tools to find quality information. And just keep these things in mind, because you will have a quiz this week over some of this. With that, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me by email or through Blackboard, and I will see you again on the next video. Thank you.